At Park Bank, we believe drive and ambition come from the deepest parts of who we are. We view achievement not as a selfish pursuit, but as a way to improve the lives of our clients, our associates, and our neighbors. We believe ultimately ambition is driven by the heart. We've grown considerably since our start as a small community bank on Park Street, and yet we've always understood that our success depends on the success of others. Our story of ambition starts right here, in the hearts of every member of our team. Our backgrounds may be different, but our values are the same. We believe in giving more than we take, that we are more successful together, and that collaborative spirit and drive are inherent in all of us. Some of our greatest pride comes from collaborating with local entrepreneurs to build vibrant businesses that make Dane County unique. We take the time to build lasting relationships and provide exceptional service grounded in shared values. Together, we bring ambition to fruition. We're privileged to work with local causes, volunteering our time and resources to make a difference in the lives of people who make our home a place unlike anywhere else. By giving back, we all move forward. As far as we've come at Park Bank, we don't ever stop at good enough. We're always looking for the next challenge, the next opportunity, the next accomplishment. Together, we can get there, anywhere, from right here. Park Bank. Let's get to next.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this afternoon's Men's Leadership Summit. My name is Alan Branch. I am the Vice President of Workforce Development at the Boys and Girls Club of Dane County. I'm happy to be here, and we have a very relevant and very important topic of discussion for you today entitled Pathways to Inclusive Economic Development and Opportunity. I'm also going to be joined by three distinct community-minded individuals that will engage in this conversation with me today. Ramon Ortiz, Jonathan Delgado, and Chris Kilgore. We also have a variety of questions that will guide us through this conversation today. But before we begin that, I'd like to provide us the opportunity to introduce ourselves. And I will begin. As I mentioned, my name is Alan Branch. I am the Vice President for Workforce Development at the Boys and Girls Club of Dane County. I'm new to the Madison community. So this is a great opportunity for me to get to know the panelists virtually here today. And I'm looking forward to opportunities to get to know them personally and to meet some of the community that has joined us today virtually as well. I've been here in the Madison for about 5 months, originally born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but spent 20 years of my career in the greater Cincinnati marketplace, where I met our president and CEO, Michael Johnson, during his time in Cincinnati. We established a great connection. I was inspired by his leadership and his passion for our youth. And when this opportunity came to consider moving to the Madison community, Michael reached out to me, and I'm certainly glad that I did. So I'm again happy to be here, looking forward to this conversation that we have today. And I will turn it over and give Ramon Ortiz an opportunity to introduce himself as well.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Yes, I am Dr. Ramon Ortiz, currently serving as the Dean of the School of Business at Madison College. I'm also the president of the Wisconsin Latino Economic Development Foundation. I'm the vice chair of the Wisconsin Latino Chamber of Commerce, and I also serve as a board member for Madison 365. It's definitely a pleasure to be here with everyone, especially speaking on such a relevant topic.
Jonathan, you want to go next?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Jonathan Delgado with the Wisconsin Latino Chamber of Commerce. I support our team with membership and outreach, making those connections between vital resources on state sides and members, and working throughout the community to advocate for the needs of the Latino business community. So thank you for having me.
And last but not least, Christopher Kilgore.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christopher Kilgore. I am the Tribal Programs Manager for the Information Technology Academy at the Department of Information Technology, University of Wisconsin-Madison. I also am the founder of an organization called Color in the Outdoors, which is a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice organization focused on outdoor spaces and inclusion in outdoor spaces. I serve on several diversity, equity, and inclusion committees and boards in the Madison and Dane County area. I was a lifelong resident until just recently of the Madison area. Grew up, went to grade school, middle school, high school, and college in Madison. So spent a lot of time there. Have had the opportunity and pleasure of actually growing up with several of our panelists in indirect ways, and very much look forward to the conversation. Have definitely had an opportunity to be involved in the business sector and business community within Madison, Dane County, and Wisconsin as a state, and have worked within a variety of different capacities in those business or surroundings. And I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation this afternoon.
Great. Thank you, Christopher. And thank you all for your introductions. So let's get right to it. As I mentioned, very relevant, very important topic when we talk about inclusive economic development and opportunity. It's a foundation for the work at the Boys and Girls Club. We focus on youth and providing them the confidence, the training, the skills to take advantage of those opportunities when they come of age and they go off into their own careers in life as well, because our focus is not only to prepare them to be the best students they can be as they journey through the educational system, but to succeed in life as well. And when I think about this topic, last week, I attended the groundbreaking with the Urban League, the Black Business Hub, and I was excited. Being new to the community, to see something like that, to have the community rally around opportunity to provide resources to business owners, Black and brown business owners, minority business owners, to try to help them level the playing field and have the same opportunity as anyone in this community to own a business, or start a business, to be successful in it. So I have high hopes for the Black Business Hub, and I hope it has the kind of impact that this community needs for people of color. But when you look at things statistically, statistics say by the year 2053, Black communities are projected to have a negative net worth. And when you look at the Latino community, it's projected that they're going to be 20 years behind that. And that begs the question. To all of us who are listening to this conversation and to those on the panel is, what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean to you? What does a more equitable economy mean to you? And I'll start with Ramon, if you don't mind addressing that question.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Yeah, I'll start by saying don't lose hope. On a projection of 2050 and then 2075, I remember that article. I think I might have actually sent that article to Henry. And in preparation for this meeting, I actually went through and tried to track down the information. It was a report called The Zero Road to Wealth, I think it is. And I was trying to look at how they projected their numbers, and I wasn't able to find that. So I'm not saying that it's not accurate. I'm just saying that, a 20 and 30 and 40-year projection there's still a lot of stuff that can be done, which brings us to this conversation, right? I think what we're really talking about is equitable economic development. When you look at it from an international perspective, you're looking at basically the nations going from third world agrarian nations to a second world semi-skilled industry to a first world advanced, highly skilled industry that improves life expectancy and quality of life. That's basically what we're talking about. But we're talking about it from the standpoint of community economic development, which brings us, I think, to a more community-driven process where we have to ask ourselves what it is that we want done, how we want our community served, and how we can address certain markers of economic health, and those being employment, one, obviously, because if you're not employed, it definitely puts a hamper on any prospects for economic development. It's difficult to begin to pay your bills, let alone build wealth. Home purchase, right? Home purchases tend to stabilize neighborhoods. They feed into property values that feed into local school district funding. Household formation, because as people come together to form households, they tend to purchase houses, right? And I think ultimately the development of your local markets, how do the goods that your community needs get acquired and consumed by those that are actually paying for them? So I think that's the conversation that we have. And I think as you approach that, you look at wealth. What is wealth? Well, we think of money, but in reality, we hear education, we hear access to banking. What you're really talking about are three things, three forms of capital, right? If you're talking about education, you're talking about human capital. The things that you have that set you apart from your competitors in terms of your ability to add value, whether it's intellectual value, the value of your labor, what have you. Economic capital is what we all know about, right? It's how much money you got in the bank, how much money Governor Evers gave us to start expanding business development. That's hard currency. We all know what that is. But I think the more important one is social capital, right? We tend to talk about it in forms of networking. What is the value of the people that you surround yourself with? And how can you leverage that access to that network to transfer value to the other forms of capital, in terms of your learning, in terms of accessing money? And I think that in many respects is what is being done in the Urban League with the Black Business Hub, right? So I think that essentially is the blueprint. Now, it's like anything else I say, right? I can tell you how to bench press 500 pounds in theory, but if I show you or do it, it's an entirely different thing, right? Put me on the bench, throw 500 pounds on my chest, and I probably won't pick it up. I can tell you how it's done. So, I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road. How exactly do we do this? And it has different implications for people of color as opposed to people of the majority. And even within people of color, there's different cultural nuances that have to be considered when we look at, addressing a more robust and equitable policy of economic development for communities of color.
Now, very well said, Ramon. And you definitely described what sounds like a roadmap, but is it the same? Is it the same in every community? The roadmap that you just defined, does that work everywhere? And that begs the question to how do you define it? How do you define exclusive economic development? Is there one definition? Does it change in different communities? How do you see that, John? How would you define inclusive economic development?
I guess the way that I see it, not textbook, right? I'm coming from point of view on this one. I think when we talk about economic development, it's a process of which commodities are being traded or bartered, whatever it is. We act in the economy on every level, from the homeless individual on our corners to the richest person out there. And, so when we talk about inclusive economic development, I think it more so speaks to, it more speaks to like the generation of dollars that we as Black and brown people are putting into the economy, right? What does that look like? Are we supporting our Black and brown owned businesses by purchasing more often in these types of communities? Are we making it an effort to make sure that those products that they're selling are also being produced by Black owned businesses? It's a deep process, right? So at the bottom line of it, I think it comes back to one's health, right? So the ability to actually do something on an intellectual level, you have to be satisfying all the basic needs of your living, right?
Yeah.
So that we can now plan how we're going to engage our economic systems, right? You know, whether that's financial literacy, buying homes, doing anything. So it's hard because I think we could look at it from two different perspectives, as a person with little to no access to capital, and from the perspective of a financial institution or person with access to capital. Mm-hmm. And there would be two ways or routes you would work to be more inclusive depending on where you land, right? So, and that's kind of where I would go with, like, how you define inclusive economic development is making sure that we discern the difference between the people who are the gatekeepers and the people who are just trying to get across the gate.
And I agree with that 100%. It's being at the table, you know, having the opportunity to be at the table, and it definitely impacts race. It definitely impacts race, where everyone, you know, has an opportunity to be what it is that they want to be, and that they have that opportunity and resources and support from the community that they live in, that they will run these businesses in, giving everybody a place at the table, regardless of the color of your skin, where you live, where you grew up. You know, to be a community that has inclusive opportunities economically for everyone provides that opportunity to everyone liberally. We haven't forgotten you, Chris. We haven't forgotten, but another important aspect as you look at this picture is the importance of financial inclusion. When you talk about economic prosperity, financial inclusion and economic integration for people of color, for Black and brown people of color in the community. How do you see that, Chris, playing out here in our region, here in Madison and where we live and work?
Well, you know, in talking about financial inclusion, I mean, I think the big word there obviously is inclusion. And I'll tell you, I mean, I you know, grew up in Madison. I grew up in Madison and worked in a whole variety of different capacities, worked with a variety of different organizations, was one of the early members of the 100 when it first started in Madison, and saw how that impacted in and of itself our community, and talking about how, as people were doing better, were doing well, they were doing their best to include those next generations or include those around them that may not be in the same space. Mm-hmm. And I think that's when we're talking about inclusion, that's oftentimes, especially in conversations with folks of color, we talk about how the others don't include us. And I think we need to, that is true. I mean, we know this is true. We know these truths to be self-evident. But at the same time, I think that we also need to keep in mind that we have to talk about inclusiveness and inclusivity within our own groups, and making sure that it isn't, you know, there's that suburban or that suburb migration. When folks do okay and do well, they tend to move out of the city, and that we see in cities across the country. That's not a new dynamic or a new phenomenon. As opposed to, as folks do well or do better, making sure that goes back into the community that they're in, and make sure that we can continue to uplift those in the community, so that those communities don't remain or don't become spaces that people are trying to get out of, but instead become and remain places where people want to be and want to come to, both from an economic perspective, but also just from an environmental perspective. If the community is, to that point, a good one, if there are schools available, if there are jobs available, if there is food available, we could look at the hierarchy of human needs and see that there are certain things missing in some of the communities where we're seeing economic disparity, where we're seeing deficit. And I think that to that point, when you talk about that seat at the table, one of the things that I talk about quite often in circles of diversity, equity, and inclusion is we don't just need a seat. We need a plate, we need a knife, we need a fork, we need a napkin, we need a glass, we need a drink, and we need the meal. And we need to make sure that people are passing the potatoes and that it's not just, well, we gave you a seat. What else do you need or what else do you want? I think, again, to that point, though, of inclusiveness is we need to look at it in terms of, do we necessarily always have to wait for someone to give us what we need, as opposed to, can we collectively as an organization, as a group, as a people, can we get what we need? Can we create what we need? I had a conversation years ago now with a good friend of mine who was talking about food deserts in Madison. And I think many folks know who I'm talking about. And eventually that person started a market in one of those areas where there was a food desert, and that market is doing well. And that market is providing to a community, and that market is starting to provide jobs, starting to provide economically feasible pricing on food that is local, in the sense of, this is food that the folks that live in these neighborhoods eat. And you don't have to try to travel to get to where you're going in order to spend that money. And eventually that becomes problematic. And so you move closer to those big box stores, and that neighborhood starts to shift. So creating an environment on a variety of levels that gives you the seat at the table, the plate at the table, and the meal. And I think that there in and of itself is one of those things that we tend not to see, as far as how can we continue to economically develop a space, is those bare needs that we have to establish for one another and for ourselves in order to maintain that space, literally and figuratively, to succeed. And I think that, to the point of education and using that as a resource as well, using that as a commodity, if you will, we have to look at those schools that our young people are going to and that our graduates are going to, and do those schools provide those necessary tools in order to establish the idea of success, as opposed to the picture of success drawn by somebody else, and quite frankly, drawn not only by someone else, but for someone else. And instead of having those, we talk about representation, we talk about how representation matters. As a community, continuing to represent those successes and those paths to success that can create that economic boom and boost for our young people, but also for our not so young people, in order to continue to encourage them to access the resources that they don't have, but also to share the resources they do, in order to make sure that everyone is doing well. It's the lift as you climb ideology that I'll give my past friend, Jackie DeWalt, who has left us, but it left a legacy. And that was one of the main messages, was lift as you climb. And I want to make sure I give her credit for having said that originally. But I think that that's something we really do need to talk about, as far as how can we economically succeed in economic equity. We need to talk about making sure that equity isn't just coming from what we have a tendency to look at as the haves, right? But from each other and for each other. There's some equity in that too. It's sharing the wealth in order to make sure that wealth maintains and grows.
Wow. Thanks for that, Chris. And I love what you said. It's not only about getting a place at the table, but having the utensils to be able to eat as well. That is very powerful. And when you think about resources, is there still a technology gap that we're facing for minorities and Black and brown folks in this community, inspiring to own their own businesses and be successful in businesses? How does technology, and what role does technology play in creating these new economic opportunities? And I'm going to leave that for any one of you that want to jump in and take it first.
Yeah, I'll jump in. And this is based on my experience having served on the Latino Chamber of Commerce during the pandemic. I think, originally the assessment was you would hear about the digital divide, lack of access to technology and so forth in communities of color. This was usually back in the early 2000s. But I think one of the things that has happened with technology is it has become so inexpensive that it is actually disseminated throughout the community. Most people have access to email and so forth through their phone. They can take videos and things like that. So they're a lot more technically savvy than maybe I was growing up in terms of the younger generation. I think you're people aged 20 to 30. I'm pushing 50, so I'm a lot older than them. So I think that there's still lack of access to technology, but I think what's needed more is to be able to leverage and understand how those technologies can be utilized for the purpose of business development. When the pandemic happened, one of the things that we did at the Latino Chamber is we went virtual, similar to what Madison College did during the pandemic. Their teaching, they went virtual. Madison College, however, had a history of having developed online courses. So it was a matter of scaling up that capacity, whereas somebody like the Latino Chamber did not have a history of teaching virtually. But one of the things that did happen is that our span of service increased, and the need for being able to have technological interfaces for conducting business. What do I mean by that? Having a website where you can set up orders and charge through a credit card. These are all things that in the past, some businesses wouldn't have had. They needed the assistance to be able to do this, hence the technical assistance, right? So regardless of whether it's a formal education or nonprofit community-based organizations, providing entrepreneurs the space that they need and the training that they need to retool on technology on an ongoing basis. Because technology nowadays is moving so quickly, and the technological aspect of commerce is changing so quickly that an entrepreneur essentially has to retool themselves continuously to stay at the forefront of their market. Otherwise, they will be left behind.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, like that e-commerce right now is one of the fastest growing markets out there right now. And, it's within the Latino community, e-commerce or using technology is probably one of the biggest opportunities. But in addition, a huge hurdle for our individuals who are older or who might have an email address, but not know how to navigate, how do I set up my own domain? How do I set up any of the accounts to make sure that it's going into my bank accounts? Or, I think that in my personal opinion, like people my age, I say even out to 50, right? Because I feel like people in their 50s, they're the one who made us all these cool gadgets and things like that we got. But I think it's more so because a lot of people think technology is specialized, right? That you can't engage with the type of technology that you have because you need a degree or you need something or another. But a lot of times there's these online services that will teach you how to start a website, go on YouTube. I think right now, I hate the notion or the comment that I don't know how to do that or XYZ when you have literally all of the world's compiled information in the palm of your hand. There's no excuse anymore to say, I don't know how to do something, because you have like these devices in your hands, but that on the flip side, a lot of people just don't think in that mindset that, oh, okay, well, I can figure it out, or it's not as difficult as what it is. So I would say technology is probably one of the biggest opportunities for Black and brown folks. So if they're not on it, you got to get on it.
And I think Ramon brought up a good point when you talk about institutions and what role that institutions in this community, in our community, can play in having a positive effect on the topic of discussion that we're having today. Is Ramon said, when Madison College responded and started offering virtual courses in a time of a pandemic, does educational institutions, does business institutions in this community, do they have a role? Should they be participating in some way to have an impact on economic opportunity and development. Do you guys see institutions playing a role in this to make a positive impact as we progress in this space?
So I'll jump in on this one. As I work at the Information Technology Academy, and the whole goal of our program is to get students ready to that point of decreasing the digital divide, get them ready at the high school level for college and for beyond. It's not just college, it's about developing them as leaders, developing them as individuals that can then navigate whatever system they decide to enter into after high school. And I think it is absolutely imperative that all levels of education do play a role in preparing our students for these things. One of the things that I think is also incredibly important is understanding that everyone that can log into, everyone that has access to these various, to Google. I don't want to use brands, but that's almost like using Kleenex. It's the tissue. It's called the thing because of the thing. So, but if you have access to this information and you can search to that point, if you can search and figure out how to do things, you can how to just about anything. Mm-hmm. What tends to happen, unfortunately, is especially in our communities where the funding to that point is not necessarily as good as it could be for the school systems. And so the schools say, well, then we're just going to give these kids the basics. We're just going to give them what they need to pass these scores in order to get these tests, in order to move on to the next level. Whereas the schools elsewhere that have the financial wherewithal and means, they have all these really cool alternative classes. They have all these really neat, like coding and how to run 3D printers when we're talking about technology. And so again, to that point, on some levels, our students are being set up in some ways to be well behind the curve by the time they reach that threshold. So programs like ITA and others within the Madison and surrounding communities that are really diligently and intentionally working at keeping our students not only up to speed, but well beyond that curve by the time they get to that threshold of what am I going to do, post K-12. I do think it is an absolute necessity to continue to instill upon institutes of higher learning, but also businesses, because to that point, institutions will say, hey, we don't necessarily have the funding, we don't necessarily have the resource. And I think that's where the business community should and can step up and say, what can we do to offset and or supplement that in order to make sure that all of our young people coming out of that 12th grade level are ready for the next steps, and not just ready because they've gotten an A on a test once, and not just ready because they were able to make it through without being suspended, and all of these types of things that are also important. But, what is the rubric and what are the benchmarks that we can say for our young people that they have received this training, this knowledge, this experience, so that to that point of business, one of the things that we do with our seniors, our rising seniors, for instance, is we have a program called Get Invested, and they are supposed to look at a problem in society and try to solve it from a technological perspective, and then market it as if it's going to be a saleable item. And what we've done is we've taken it to the next level, and we've had business owners and or managers in the community come in and judge these things. And in some cases, those business owners and managers have actually connected with those students and said, that's actually a fantastic idea. I'd like to pursue this further. So to that point, we're giving the students an example of something that can be achieved based on the work that they're doing, the real, and we talk about, for instance, in literature, the who, what, when, where, how. But oftentimes when we talk about business education, and especially when we're talking about economic development, we don't talk about the why anywhere near as aggressively and intentionally as we should. Why do our young people need to know these things, and to what end? How can we do this, but why are we doing this? And I think that also then creates a sense of not necessarily just urgency, but importance for those young people as to, I can see myself as this person because now I know why I should and could be doing these things. So I think it is absolutely imperative that institutions of higher learning, institutions of K-12 learning, but then the business community figure out better ways of collaborating and partnering so that the institutions of education are getting feedback from the next level, from the workforce saying, this is what we're looking for. This is what we need. How can we help? And then the schools can then report back and say, this is what we need to do to adjust in order to prepare the needs once our students are out of school and moving on to the job market.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, and we see the same opportunity with the Boys and Girls Club. And I've heard of other projects here in our community that's focusing on providing resources, skills, training to folks, people of color, so they can compete. Everyone knows throughout this whole entire country, there's a job shortage almost in every industry. And at the Boys and Girls Club, we are going to be focusing on the skilled trades, providing opportunities for the more than almost 7,000 youth that we are in contact with each year who know nothing about, have no idea that these opportunities actually exist. And then we had a question in the chat box that reads: the state has just invested $57 million in organizations that support Black and Brown owned businesses, the Madison Black Chamber, the Wisconsin Latino Chamber, et cetera. Is that enough to make a meaningful difference? How is this money going to make its way back to those business owners? Anyone want to make a stab at that, answering that question?
Yeah, that's a good question. Very good question. It's a little nuanced to unpack because each one of those organizations operates differently. Some organizations may get most of it or some of it closer to the business owners quickly through the form of a revolving loan. Others that it'll take longer for that value to get to them, and that value will have to be transformed from money, right, dollars, to actual hard skills in the form of entrepreneurial training. So you can't use one metric. Now, I think the metric that you can use is how many businesses have you been impacted? How many have you started or supported? I think that's a fair metric. So in terms of whether or not that's enough, I mean, I think it's a good start, and I commend the governor for what he did. But I don't think there's no easy fix. There's no silver bullet. I mean, I think one of the things, if you want to be optimistic about the conversation that we're having right now, it's really not a conversation based on doing what's morally right. Not that there's not a justified reason for equity. I mean, I think that's an old conversation. I don't even like to engage in it because I don't think it's gotten us too far. We're still in many respects in the same situation that we were before. I like to create a sense of urgency around the fact that it is a necessity. Because if you look at the demographics of where they are socially from now until 2050, more than half of your population is going to look like us. And if we maintain the same level of poverty, the same disparities in achievement, that is socially, economically, and politically unsustainable, right? If we're going to be sustained as a society at the current standard of living of a first world country, we have to reach out to previously ignored communities and integrate them in the economic system. We have to look at the fastest growing segments of our community. We need to invest in our youth. And our youth is increasingly youth that don't look like the mainstream, or at least what was defined as mainstream before. So I think it's a good start. The money that's invested in the businesses, I think it'll make an impact. I think it was much needed, especially after the pandemic. And I commend the governor for what he did, his foresight. But I think this is just the beginning. I think any serious conversation that anyone has about economic development in Wisconsin has to have an equity inclusion component. And that component has to be tied to demographics. And that discussion on demographics has to speak to the growing populations, right? In different population centers, it needs to be responsive to various populations, right? So it's not an end all be all check off the box, you're fine. It's looking at the most useful segments of your population, which are growing the fastest, which have the greatest need, and investing in them accordingly. Not doing anything different than what you would have done in previous generations, but maybe adjusting your delivery of the academics for that population. I'll give you an example. The high school systems that we have now, in many respects, they're a blend of both the agrarian and industrial worlds that we lived in, all right? The reason why we have summer vacation is because we used to do that when we were mainly a farming state. There's no other reason when we should have summer vacation. I would do away with it if I was, the czar of education, but I'm not. Most countries don't have a summer vacation. That was designed to meet the labor needs of the farming families in the country, right? In places like Wisconsin and elsewhere. The reason why we have classes and we have bells that run kids from class to class is because we were based on a factory model that used to train people and prepare them for entry-level work in a factory. All right. That world has changed. We need to look at more innovative and responsive models of education, similar to like what Madison College does with the Early College STEM Academy. You've got students who are interested in science that in the 10th grade can apply to a program that partners with Madison College. This is MMSD students. And you graduate high school, completing your high school requirements at the same time having an associate's degree that meets the requirements for your general studies. That is phenomenal because the cost of education, which was previously borne by the public sector. In the past, if you got a high school diploma, you were gainfully employed. Now you need to go to college. But that cost has been passed on to the private individual. I think partnerships like that exactly between Madison College and Madison Metropolitan School Districts is one example of an innovative partnership that can start to address the realities of the 21st century.
Thank you, Ramon. And what would you say? I mean, let's say that money doesn't get back to prospective business owners or the $50 million that's referenced in that question isn't enough, where the state can't solve the issue. How does someone individually, how do you build ownership? Is it educate? Are there tools? What can people do inspired to be leaders, to be business owners in this community of color and communities of color? What can they do? Is it education? What are the tools that they need to make this happen for themselves or give them an opportunity at all?
Well, since everybody is quoting people who are mentors, Chris here quoted Jack Lee DeWalt. I will quote an old mentor who I had the pleasure of speaking at his memorial a week ago, Dr. Roger Pulliam. He used to always say self-determination. And I think that's what you're talking about, right? We can talk about what the state did and the monies that were given. The reality is this. The state is not going to create prosperity. The state can create the conditions for prosperity by having laws in place that protect property ownership, that facilitate the lending of capital, that make sure that we're not discriminating in the lending of capital, that provide training through our public institutions and educational institutions. But ultimately, the community is going to have to decide what type of world they want to live in, right? What are the needs of your local area? How you want to serve your community, right? Like the example that Chris Kilgore was talking about. If there's a food desert in your neighborhood, maybe you need to open up a store, right? Why does somebody else have to come open up a store if you think there's a food desert in your neighborhood? Maybe there's a food desert in their neighborhood and they're trying to open up a store in their neighborhood, right? So I think that is one of the keys. And if you look at I'll refer you to two reports, right? There is the Economic State of Black America 2022 McKinsey report that says that in 2019, Black households spent about $835 billion. Now, why do I mention that? Because the other day I was at a dinner at the Greater Madison Chamber of Commerce, and there was a woman there who talked about the idea of buying Black as a business. And I think that's a great idea because there is money that moves a lot within that community that could be recycled in other ways. I mean, that's one step. That's another example of self-determination. For others, like the Latino communities, in many respects, our language barrier and cultural barrier creates a somewhat barriers to entry in a market, and also create a space that makes us competitive relative to other peers. In other words, if I speak Spanish and I'm selling groceries that are unique to my ethnic group, it's very difficult for some white guy down the street to, open up a store, speak to everybody in Spanish and sell the same products with the same quality of service. So those are the things that you look at in terms of building capacity and self-determination. I think the state needs to be responsive and create the conditions for it. But the reality is that ultimately self-determination is community driven. The community must decide how it wants to live and what legacy it wants to leave its children, right?
Thank you for that. That's very insightful, Ramon. And you kind of answered, and this has been an awesome dialogue, guys. And I'm hoping that our audience is appreciating your insight. but we do have a time on this, and we do have one other question. And there's only there's two questions in the chat right now. So let's end with the last question. And you kind of addressed it a little bit, Ramon, with the resiliency and the tenacity to achieve. But there are barriers. I mean, hey, there are barriers. And for those who might be listening, can we speak a little bit to some of those barriers that Ramon didn't mention just recently, and some strategies, not only the barriers, but some strategies that you might be aware of that folks can take advantage of to overcome those barriers and achieve their goals.
If I can, I'll just start by saying, Ramon is spot on, right? I think it's kind of hard when we talk about like the pathways and this and that, but at the end of the day, it is up to our own communities. The $57 million is a drop in a bucket. In my opinion, it's a great start, but it doesn't necessarily, we're talking about trillions owed to the Black community, right? We're talking about a whole lot of injustices that happen on a daily basis. And it does start with us, right? And so I would say, it's the mindset, right? And not a lot of us are brought up with the thought of self-determination. Not a lot of us are actually, we're put in communities, and we're born into communities that are strategically not taught mindset. Right. And then the education, access to healthcare, mental health care, dentistry, vision. We need to really take care of ourselves, put ourselves first, trying to heal from our own trauma, not including the trauma that we've gotten from over the time. But a lot of, how I see people is that they really focus on themselves, secluding themselves from toxic, maybe family members or people around them. They cut their circles, change their circles, move it around. They put themselves around people who encourage them, who support them, who speak positively about the work that they might be doing in any particular field. And then, taking care of ourselves. But that means that we also have to be paying it forward as well, encouraging our youth, encouraging people that if you didn't make it, now you can make it later. I think that it does start with us. But we need our facilities. We need our own resources to be able to then give back and do more, right? So at the end of the day, in my opinion, it starts with yourself, and really making sure that your mind, body, and soul are straight. Because a lot of times out in our communities, it's like a war zone. How can you get how can you get your household straight when everything around you is in chaos all the time, right? So and then mindset, education, and then we go on to, financial literacy and all these other things. But it's like a step-by-step process. It's not going to be overnight. I think people need to understand that economic freedom and to participate in these it's you're working on it every day, trying to be better than you were yesterday. And I think that's where it really starts. It's just knowing yourself and then trying to learn more, educate yourself, and support the community around you.
Well, thank you for that, John and Ramon. You both were on the same plane. Thank you for your transparency. Yes, that 15 million, drop in the bucket, pebble of sand. And that relates to one of the questions. We got a question in the chat box. And again, thank you guys. Those were all the questions that we had to guide us through this conversation today. Thank you for your honesty, your transparency, and your insight in addressing this subject. But someone asked, what else can public policy makers and legislators, et cetera, do to make sure the economic future is diverse and inclusive. 15 ain't enough. The 15 million. What else can they do? Any ideas?
Well, I will say this. I think it starts with understanding that all of the infrastructure, education, business development, everything needs to have an equity inclusion component. And I say that it also has to be tied to demographics. The only reason that 2055 number is happening because of a 30-year population in 2050 is going to be Latino. That's what's driving that demographic. So when I say that we have to have an inclusive approach to the discussion of diversity and inclusion, I'm also saying that what we see as diversity also has to be inclusive of all groups, right? So I think it's important for us to understand those demographics and include them in all of our economic development plans across policy. Everything should have an equity and inclusion component, in my opinion. Otherwise, it's not policy that's speaking true to the demographic realities that are occurring across the nation.
And
with a robust budget, I will put that on there too. You need the money for that too. So make sure, you got to accompany that with the dollars.
And we have another question as well. With all the COVID relief money going away, where are the next injections of capital coming from? Where can businesses and owners and entrepreneurs turn next?
I'll jump in on that one for a minute because I've had this conversation with a variety of circles about the stimulus checks and the money that's coming in and all of these types of things. And, and I think that there's this idea of, or there's this conflict at times of access versus excess and understanding that it's great. There are people that absolutely need this money or need some money from someone other than themselves because they do not have the means or the access at that moment. But the reliance on getting money from other folks, I think, is again, this mindset of we're waiting for someone else to do it. And there's an interesting conflicting kind of historic series of statements, right, where we talk about wanting to help build up our young people and trying to get them to learn the mantra, I am somebody, I am somebody. And then later on, we also have a tendency to say somebody really should do something about that. And I was like, well, there's a conflict right there, because if we're teaching our kids that they are somebody, but then as they get older, they're saying somebody should do something about that, and they're looking not in the mirror. I think that that's a big thing to kind of keep an eye on as we talk about these types of things. So even to this point, I think when we have these conversations and we say the next wave of stimulus is going to be the answer, having somebody give us money in a short-term focus is going to be the answer. That might be a start, but I think that that's where we really need to get away from. Okay, let's not talk about this insertion of stimulus money. Let's talk about long-term financial budgeting and planning from a state and or federal level that looks at this to that point, that long curve. So we're not going to just put a blip on the radar. We're not going to check some boxes and fill some quotas. We're really genuinely talking about how can we long-term, to that point of meeting that number 20 years down the road of where our population needle is shifting to, how can we sustainably, at a point of increase, continue to stimulate, but also continue to sustain what it is that we're doing in the economic community. And I think that that's one thing that oftentimes people say, well, if I could only get this money for this thing, but what's your longer vision? And I think that's something that we're doing with our children, is we're teaching them this YOLO mentality that everyone continues to throw out there. If you only live once, so you might as well do it now, versus, okay, what's my 10-year plan? What's my 15-year plan? Let's look beyond the likes and the follows on our social media platforms. And what does that mean for the long term? Can you start a business on that social media platform? It can be a both and. It doesn't have to be an either or. But if you're going to use this tool, how can you use it in a beneficial and productive and profitable way moving forward long term?
Well, thank you, Christopher. Well, we're coming up on time. Wow. Glad to have been a part of this conversation. It's been a pleasure meeting you all virtually. I enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope the folks that joined us on this call today feels the same as I do. I would like to give you guys an opportunity before we close. Is there anything that you would like to share as a closing remark with regard to the conversation we had today? We have 5 minutes left.
I will just say really quickly, thank you for the invitation.
Yes.
I think it's important. Self-determination is community-driven, and it is unique to each particular group. So I think we respect each other's space in the conversation of inclusion, but include everybody at the table.
I concur. Thank you guys for being here as well and sharing your insight through this panel. Chris, John, any last closing parting remarks?
I think that I would definitely like to piggyback on what Ramon said is it is an inclusive environment that is going to be the successful one. So I think that we need to look at it in terms of not just our Black, our Latinx, but our Asian, our Indigenous communities, all of the communities together, working together in order to make sure that we can help one another succeed on all levels. And I definitely think that if we look at just one lane and not all of them, we won't wind up getting there. So I think it's extremely important to support one another across the board.
Agree. I echo what Christopher and Ramon both said. I think I agree wholeheartedly. Together we're stronger. Divided we fall. 100%. And just keep supporting, keep pushing. Grind on. Whatever it takes. Whatever you do for business is valid. I know a lot of people will say like, "Oh, that's not legit business," but you do well, right? What you do is valid. If most likely you can make money doing it. So if there's something you want to do, however you want to engage, there's a way. You just gotta reach out to people and find your answers.
Well, thanks again, guys. Thanks again for joining us. We're at time. I don't know if Henry has some closing remarks or anything that he would like to say at this time, but really appreciate being a part of this. It's a great welcome to Madison. Like I said, it's been a pleasure. And Chris, I'm going to take you up on fishing there. It's been a great welcome. This has been a great opportunity to meet you guys. And I look forward to the opportunity to engage you personally as well.
This is 365 Media.